Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. As you guys are aware, it is coming to the end of 2019 and in a couple of weeks it's going to be 2020. So I thought I would do something a little bit different this year and not do my favourite books of 2019, but do the best books of the decade. Essentially what I have done is looked at all of the books I've read each year from 2010 to 2019 and looked at which ones I gave 5 stars and picked my favourite book/books from each year. Some years I've only picked 1 book and in other years I've picked 4 or 5 because I just read so many amazing books in that year, and you'll see what year that is when I mention it. But I thought that it would be an interesting different video to do, and obviously these are my best books of the decade, not the best books of the decade for everyone. So it's just a personal thing for me that I wanted to share with you guys. And obviously once I had compiled my list, I could see that a lot of the books that I had picked for my best books of the decade were a lot of my all-time favourite books. So it did actually work out quite well, and for some years it was actually very difficult. But let's get started with the books. I'm going to run through each year with you and the books/books I have picked. So kicking off with 2010. In 2010 I actually read my favourite book of all time, as I was in year 10 at school and my English teacher, when we were doing our creative writing coursework, told us to read this book, and I was really intrigued, and my dad bought it for me and I read it and it changed my life. And that is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. So as you know, if you watch my channel, I absolutely adore this book, and I thought it was actually quite good kicking off this list with this book, as I did read it in 2010. I haven't picked another book for 2010 because obviously this one was definitely the standout book, and I just thought that, you know, nothing else would stand out to this, and I didn't actually read anything that interesting other than this in 2010. Now moving on to 2011. In 2011 I read a very good book trilogy. Now you're probably thinking that it's a book trilogy with the film that came out in 2011, but no, it is not. So in 2011 I read all 3 books in the Millennium Trilogy, which are The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, The Girl Who Played with Fire, and The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest. Now obviously in 2011 all 3 of these books were massive. Everyone was talking about them, they were all over the book charts, they were best-selling books. You would be on the bus, on the train, and you'd see so many people reading either the first book, the second book, or the third book. And I was just so intrigued. It was the first time where I sort of realised that like these 3 books were being read by everyone and they were really popular. And I would say that I was maybe a bit young to be reading these books, but I was just so intrigued about the hype around them that I asked my mum if I could read the first one, so she bought the first one for me and I sped through it. I read it in like a week. I absolutely adored it, and then I read the second one and the same thing happened. And then the third one, which is 750 pages long, I read this in a week while on holiday in Spain with my nan. And I think that is probably one of my biggest reading achievements ever. So this trilogy definitely stood out for me for some of my favourite books of the decade, and were definitely the best books I read in 2011. So moving on to 2012. In 2012 I went on holiday to Sicily with my mum for a week, and I found these books that my best friend had told me about because she recently read them and loved them, and I found them in the works and there were 3 for £5, so I took them on holiday with me to Sicily and they changed my life. And that trilogy is The Mortal Instruments by Cassandra Clare. So obviously back in 2012 I was not involved in the book community on Twitter, on YouTube, anything like that, so recommendations from friends were probably the way forward for me in terms of book recommendations and things that might interest me. So obviously these were recommended to me by my best friend Maisie, and I remember messaging her when I got back from my holiday being like, oh my god, these books are insane. And one of the reasons why I had such a good reading experience reading these in Sicily was because down the road from our hotel, which was actually quite far away from any sort of like town, we were quite far out, there was a pizza place, and it was just a building on its own in the middle of nowhere, and it said pizza on it, but it was never open, there was never like a menu or anything like that, and it reminded me of Luke's Chinese place where all the werewolves live. And every single time I walked past it I was like, oh my god, shadow hunters live there, or werewolves live there. There's a glamour on this place, and that's why it's making me think that it's a pizza place, but I bet you it's not. So I was very much obsessed with these when I was reading them, as you can tell, because everything in Sicily was shadow hunter related to me while I was there. So moving on to 2013, I didn't actually read a lot of books in 2013. I kind of did, but they were very weird books. I went through a weird reading stage in 2013. It was bad YA fantasy, so a lot of those, probably not my favourite books. So my standout book for 2013 was The Vampire Academy by Rochelle Mead. So obviously I think I read the entire series in 2013, and it's got to be said, okay, these books are fantastic. They've got everything you want in them. And obviously this was the first vampire book I read after Twilight, and realised that there are a lot better vampire books out there. And I loved all the characters and the storyline, and one of the books is set in Russia. Absolutely adored that. So yeah, for 2013 it is the Vampire Academy series. Moving swiftly on to 2014, I have got 3 books. 2 of those are related and the other one isn't. So my standout favourite in 2014 was 1984 by George Orwell. My dad always told me that this was his favourite book, and he kept telling me to read it, and I never did until obviously 2014, and I straight away saw why this was his favourite book, and I would say that this is definitely one of my all-time favourite books, and I can't wait to reread it because it has been obviously a long time now since I read this for the first time. It's just one of those books I think everyone should read, and I can understand why some people don't like it, but I do think it is a very important book for our generation and our time and everything that is happening at the moment. So going into 2020, if you haven't read this book, I would definitely say pick it up. Whether you're going to enjoy it or not, it tells a very interesting story, and it's really terrifying seeing that when this was written all those years ago, George Orwell basically predicted what would happen in the future. It is really scary, but brilliant. The other 2 books I picked for 2014 are Shadow and Bone and Siege and Storm by Leigh Bardugo. Obviously I would have put the whole of the Grisha trilogy in with this, but I didn't read Ruin and Rising in 2014, I read it in 2015. So yes, these 2 books, and I would say that Shadow and Bone and Siege and Storm are my favourite from the 3 books anyway. Obviously, reading Shadow and Bone made Leigh Bardugo one of my favourite authors of all time, and this is still one of my favourite like YA fantasy series ever. So I'm pleased it made the list. Now we're moving on to 2015. Now 2015 was probably my best reading year of the decade in terms of books that I read and how good they were. So it was very difficult for me to pick just 1 or 2. I did manage to get it down to 4 books, but so many good books came out that year and I read them when they were released, and I think 2015 was when I started my booktube channel originally, so that's probably why as well, because I was reading all these new releases because of booktube, and yeah, so it's been difficult for me to pick only 4 books. So my first favourite book from 2015 was The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton. Now this book, I think about it all the time. It's just one of those historical fiction standalone books that is so unique and so different to anything I've ever read, and the story and the writing, just everything about it just makes it a wonderful book. And this came out I think in 2015, so I read it when everyone else on booktube was reading it, and I would still say it's probably one of my favourite books just because it is so unique and different, and I definitely want to reread this soon. My next favourite in 2015 was Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor, and I am so glad I've read this book. So a friend bought me this for either Christmas or my birthday, and I'm so glad that she did, because oh my god, when I finally read this I completely understood why people are obsessed and love it, because Laini Taylor's writing is just out of this world. I think as a writer she is probably one of my favourite writers, because her writing is just magical and amazing, and she can just, it's just so poetic, and I'd never come across that before, so this was definitely a standout book for me in 2015. And again, this is another one that I can't wait to reread. a lot of these books, my favourite books of the decade, are ones that I will probably be rereading in the near future. The next book is another book by one of my favourite authors, and I did read one of her books, her most famous book, for the first time in 2013, but it wasn't as good as this one, so that's why I picked this one instead, and that is Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier. So Rebecca is my mum's favourite book, so in 2013 I finally got round to reading her favourite book, and I really enjoyed it. And then they did an adaptation of Jamaica Inn in 2015, so it made me want to read the book. And I'm so glad I did, because this is probably one of my favourite books ever, and definitely one of my favourite couples in a book, because Mary and Jem are just life. I just love them so much. I would also say that Mary is probably one of my favourite protagonists in a book, because she's just so feisty, and she's got so much flair and power and just anger in her, but she channels it in a really good way. So yes, I'm so pleased that this one made the list. My last favourite from 2015 was All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. Again, this was a book that was massive on BookTube in 2015, and one of the reasons why I decided to pick it up, as I do love historical fiction novels, which I forget about because I don't read them as often as I should, but every historical fiction book I've read I have loved, and this was one of them. Again, this novel is a novel that tells a very interesting different story. It's set in World War II, and it follows different perspectives. It follows a blind girl and a boy that gets sent to a camp, I think to become a Nazi when he's quite young, and then their paths cross, and it's just, the story is insane. So much happens, and for a debut novel this was just fantastic, and obviously the cover is absolutely gorgeous. But I knew that this was probably going to make my list of the best books of the decade, because again, it's one that I think about quite a lot and would like to reread. It just is quite hefty and lengthy, so I would have to set myself quite a bit of time, I think, to just sort of delve back into this story. Moving on to 2016, I've got two books for 2016. The first of these being Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and this was actually a reread for me in 2016, but the reason why I picked it for this year and not 2010 when I first read it was because in 2010 I read it for school, and yes, I did enjoy it, but I think my reread of it, I enjoyed it even more because it wasn't for school, and I read this in, I think, 12 hours on a flight home from Malta, where I was on my year abroad, and I was just absolutely stunned that I'd left it so long to reread it, and I didn't realise how much I was going to love it again, and it's probably one of my favourite classics of all time. The other book that I picked for 2016 is another historical fiction novel, and that is Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks. See, this one was a really interesting one for me because this was talked about quite a lot when I was doing A-level English. As a girl that I sat next to, it was her favourite book, and then everyone else I seemed to speak to after that were like, oh yeah, it's a fabulous book, it's amazing, it's this, it's that, and I was like, why? And then someone told me that a lot of it's written in French, which it isn't, so that kind of put me off reading it. And then obviously I watched the TV show and realised it's actually a very interesting story, so I bought the book, and I had the book for 3 years before I read it, but boy am I glad I got round to reading this. I think this is probably one of the most harrowing war novels I have ever read. You read it and you just want to sob your eyes out. It's really sad, and it tells a completely different story of war to the other novels I've read. It kind of doesn't glamorise war, but this gets into the nitty-gritty of the First World War and the trenches, and there's also a love story, and I just remember a quote in it, because there's flashbacks as well to sort of the present day, from the person's sort of family member, and she's at a war memorial and she's reading all the names, and she just turns around and mutters to herself, why didn't anybody tell us? And I think that explains this book as a whole, because that's how I felt when I was reading it, that yes, you get taught in school about the First and Second World Wars, but they don't actually explain how awful it was, and this book does that. We are now on to 2017, and I was very late in joining this party, but in 2017 I did, and I've picked two books because they are a duology, and that is obviously the Six of Crows duology by Leigh Bardugo, and that is Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom. So I obviously knew about these books, and I knew that Leigh Bardugo was a fantastic writer because I loved the Grisha trilogy, but for some reason it took me ages to read Six of Crows, and then I read it, and then I immediately bought Crooked Kingdom because it had just come out, and then read that. And as Leigh Bardugo is one of my favourite writers, I'm pleased that this trilogy also made it to the list, but these were the standout books I read in 2017. Nothing else even got close. So yes, these are the books that were my favourite in 2017. Now moving on to 2018. I had a half and half sort of reading year in 2018. Half of it was kind of a bit slow and a bit meh, and then the other half I read loads of really good books, but I picked two books for 2018. The first of those being The Unite Circus by Erin Morgenstern, obviously because this book I think is probably very close to The Book Thief in my eyes in terms of being one of my all-time favourite books. It's just fantastic. I don't even understand how Erin Morgenstern wrote this kind of story, where you feel the magic of the circus as if you're in the circus. It's just insane. The other book I have picked for 2018 was a non-fiction book, and that is Reasons to Stay Alive by Matt Haig, and I was actually really struggling in 2018. My mum got ill and loads of other stuff happened in my life, and I didn't cope very well with it, and I kind of refused to believe what was going on with me, and I had so many people asking me like, are you okay? Like, clearly knowing that I wasn't okay. So when I realised that I wasn't, I thought it was probably time to read Reasons to Stay Alive, as I'd heard nothing but amazing things about it, and I wouldn't be lying when I said that it sort of saved my life, because it made me realise I wasn't alone, it made me realise what was happening to me, and it made me be able to sort of move forward with my life, and I am still so grateful for that book, and it would have been wrong if it hadn't have made my best books of the decade. So we have finally made it to 2019. Now, strangely, I've actually only picked two books for 2019, even though I've read 50 this year, which is the most books I've ever read. But I was kind of comparing a lot of the 5-star books I've read this year to other books that my favourite ones of the decade, and came up with these two, and I think they do fit in quite well. The first of those being Feminists Don't Wear Pink and Other Lies, and I read this earlier on in the year and straight away 5 stars, reviewed it, still think it's like one of the most amazing books ever. I think it should be given to like women and men everywhere to read because it's just so educational, it's inspiring, it's just everything you'd want in a feminist book. And it reads very quickly because it's in short essays. There's nothing I didn't like about this book, and I definitely think with where we're going in 2020 and all of the sort of improvements we have had in terms of feminism, but there obviously is a lot more to go, that this one definitely needed to make the list. And last but not least is probably my all-time favourite classic that I read this year, and I cannot wait to reread it because it was insane, and I can't believe I waited this long to read it because everyone said that I would love it, and I did. And that is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. So I did know the story of The Picture of Dorian Gray, but not too in depth. But when you read it, it's funny, it's creepy, it's gothic-y, it tells a very interesting story and like morals and just everything. And I kind of thought I could see where it was going at the end. And then when it happened at the end, I was like, oh my god. Yeah. So it was one of those books that I enjoyed every single part of it, including the ending, and for me, endings to books make the entire book. So definitely The Picture of Dorian Gray is also one of my favourite books of the decade. So those are some of my favourite books of the decade. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I really enjoyed filming it and compiling my list, and I just think it's a really interesting concept to look back at all the books that you've read in the last 9-10 years and pick out your favourites. Please let me know if you have any books that stand out as your favourite books that you've read in the past 10 years, and maybe I'll add them to my to read list. Thank you guys so much for watching, and hopefully see you soon in another video. Bye!